And we're live. Welcome to the Coach Support Show, where science meets strategy. And today we're going to start off by talking about communication.
Great. Hi, everyone. Hi, John. So communication, it's a very relevant topic for coaches. And I think there's an awful lot to talk about that is sort of good in theory, interesting, maybe harder to achieve in practice. And there's also on the other side of things, like a lot of practical frameworks and things to talk about that maybe in theory help us to improve our coaching communication, our ability to speak with others and inspire others. But yeah, a fascinating topic, and not least because coaches do a lot of it. And in our teams, we often lead in that respect. So something I think that is worth breaking down on another episode of the Coach Sports Show. But sort of firstly, what does it mean to you when we talk about communication?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because mostly when people say communication, the first thing that comes to mind is the kind of psychology of the interpersonal dynamics and a lot about active listening and that kind of thing. And so when I proposed this topic last week, I haven't been able to think of a better word for it. I don't know, maybe communication out is really what I'm interested in talking about, at least from the beginning, or how to speak good or something like that. Of course, definitely not just speaking. And I think even if you are focused on just communication out, you should be thinking about the other aspects of it, which we'll get into later. But for me, I actually think I said this on Twitter not recently, a while ago, that this is potentially one of the areas that we're weakest at in esports, especially if I compare it to coaches in other fields. So I think there's a lot of things we do now in esports that are pretty good and kind of nearing the top of high performance in other fields as well, which is fantastic and absolutely wasn't always the case, but we're progressing very rapidly because we've got so much to learn from, which is really, really good. But a lot of coaches that I see in even behind the scenes content or have listened to them talk to their teams, I think could put a lot or get a lot of value very quickly, actually, by just focusing on how I talk, how I communicate, how I present myself, both, my visual image, but also my vocal image and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I like the way, what we're saying, like the output of the communication piece. Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear you think that we've got better, like as a field, like esports coaching is heading in the right direction. So are you conscious as a coach yourself then? Are you conscious of your output and what you're saying?
Massively. So this is why I'm so passionate about it. I spent a lot of time now over the last few years working on it. Not actually that much beforehand. And I was I think we can get a little bit kind of precious around this and a little bit egotistical around it, even when we haven't done the work. And we feel like, I talk for my job. I talk to groups of people for my job. Every VOD review, I have to talk for 20 minutes. And so I remember actually it was my mum first who mentioned I was going on a stream and mentioned you really use a lot of filler words. So ums and ahs and likes and that kind of thing. And my response was really defensive around it. But actually, of course, she was right. And it just is damaging what I'm trying to say and damaging the message that I'm trying to get across. And it's just another skill that I should have been working on. So I've spent a long time working on this. And that's actually why I first started a YouTube channel. If you go back and look at my first series of videos, they were just me talking to a camera filmed around like our apartment or different places in Le Mans. And while it was around these coach kind of topics and around the stuff that is now become obviously a huge part of my career and what I do, a big part of it was just to practice speaking. And I was working with a vocal coach at the time, and I was looking for an opportunity to practice, because doing it in a conversation is one thing, but turning a camera on and doing it, performing it, is a different thing. And so I've just gone hugely deep into all of this stuff. I think it's absolutely fascinating, but also it's so easy to start to see returns on it. If you find an area of what you're doing that you haven't looked at before, and that's an amazing opportunity. Just like if we never realized a certain thing about the way we play the game, and now we can suddenly just get a million times better by just spending a small amount of effort. And then I've then, of course, seen it everywhere else in esports. And there are some people, I think, who can communicate really, really well and who can give a good speech. And there are some people who struggle to get through a sentence coherently. And that cannot be useful and cannot be a beneficial way to approach coaching, I think.
Yeah. I think we already have some strong themes or categories to chat about in what you've just said there. I mean, what is good communication? And let's say today we as you say, we're referring to the output, like what is being said. It's like, what is it? And then how to develop it. So in my preparation for today's show, I tried to focus a lot on the latter, and I found it very difficult. I think there are a lot of quite general frameworks and ideas about what it is, and less so about how exactly concretely to develop it and practice it. But one of those, as hopefully we'll get into, about experience. But just the point about what is it? Like, what is good communication from a coaching standpoint? I actually used to teach a class at a university around English for academic purposes. So the use of language in presentations at universities or written, but mainly it was spoken word stuff. And filler words came up a lot. And we used to use the classic, like a post-game interview with David Beckham, and he'd sort of use a lot of you knows. And I think we had like a you know clock, and he'd fill almost every other word with a you know, and it clocked up like 50 in a minute or something. It was outrageous. However, I forgive him completely, because some filler words are quite useful to improve the flow in terms of not having awkward, broken sentences. I'm often, where I pause sometimes when I speak, I could be adding a filler, and it could make it slightly more smooth and flowy to listen to and comprehend. But yeah, even just knowing what to say and what makes it good, I think that could be an hour of talk by itself. But how have you figured out what's good? Have you had good feedback on what you're saying?
I have actually, which is always nice, when you're working on something like that. And I have it more recently than I used to have it, which is always another thing as well. I think I maybe passed on a bunch of those to the vocal coach that I was working with, because obviously good for her to see the improvement, which is really, really nice. For me, I think a really good way to think about all this kind of stuff is if it detracts from the message, then it's a problem. So someone I'm going to reference a huge amount is a guy called Vin Zhang, who is a communications teacher. Now, I'm going to do that thing that people often do when they find people when they're small and now they're massive. When I stumbled across his channel randomly like 3 or 4 years ago when it was really, really new, and now he's absolutely huge everywhere. But it's because he provides so much value and can instantly give you a load of tools that will they can be life-changing. And he's just so good at it. So he was a keynote speaker, but then started moving into teaching other people to do that. So he used to tour around the world and teach big companies and stuff like that, but now he does a lot of it online, and he shares a huge amount of stuff for free. So I'm going to use him a lot and have used him a lot alongside the other people that I've worked with more personally. But one of the things that he says that I really like is about accents. Accent is completely fine unless it distracts from the clarity of the message. So he's Vietnamese, but lived his whole life in Australia. And he was talking about working in the US and having to tone down his accent and actually learn how to speak and create the mouth shapes a little bit differently, because being obviously from Australia is completely fine, or being obviously from Vietnam before that is also completely fine. But if people can't understand what you're saying, then that's where it's a problem. So it's the same with the filler words for me. If it detracts from the message, and I don't just mean the message is what you say, if it detracts from the message that you're trying to give, or you're trying to instill in someone, that emotion that you're trying to instill, if it ruins that, then it's a problem. And if it makes you less clear, then it's a problem. And that's, I think, the way to look at it. Because you're right, getting rid of them completely not only is a lot harder than getting rid of 90% of them, which I think is much easier than people give it credit for, but it also isn't necessarily better. And you have a danger of sounding a little bit kind of robot-y as well. So there is something to that for sure. But whenever it detracts from the message, that would be my go-to way of analyzing it.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. The clarity point, I've come across a few different frameworks start with that. So effective communication contains 6 elements. This is by a researcher called Crooks, 1991. The first step is clear and concise, clear and concise and correct, all this kind of stuff. But it starts with clarity and how it's spoken, how it's presented. Also, a sort of precursor is, are you clear on the message you want to convey, which might reduce the amount of filler words, the ums, the ahs, you knows that you might slot in there while you're thinking on your feet, which I have sometimes been, fault foul of during this podcast. But okay, so there we go, filler word. Now I'm really conscious of it.
Now you're going to be very conscious of it. Don't worry, because when we get there, I'll give you some tools to get better at it.
There we go. So then we could just go check out this chap's podcast and pick up all the tools. But I think our podcast focus is quite interesting because for coaches and for coaches in esports specifically, if you look at coaching literature, we're often told about the value of what we say, but also the gestures that accompany it. So that non-verbal body language. You see it all the time. The classic, like, what is good sports coaching? And you'll see a coach on the field being quite expressive, big smile on their face, and being open towards players. The obvious asterisks that we have to deal with on this show will be that, are we hamstrung in esports in that we have to rely so much on what we say rather than the accompanying body language around it? Or is there an advantage
I think we absolutely are. I have a rule personally, it's a little bit different when we're all streaming, that every meeting and every VOD review, cameras go on. And I like that a lot because I like to be able to see people. But you'll notice I specifically don't have the camera just around my face because I want to be able to do this. It helps me talk better even if you can't hear me. It helps me express myself a lot better. But if you can see me, sorry if you can't see me, if you can see me, it's also more useful as well. And it's just, again, another tool. I think it's really interesting because the way that I ever come across papers is not reading them, but reading a book where someone references them. So one thing that's very interesting, which is a book that I think is absolutely fantastic, which is The Tough Stuff by a guy called Cody Royal. He was talking about a paper that was looking into coach communication, and they identified these areas, which is verbal, non-verbal, self-talk, written, visual, behavior, and listening. And those are the ways, the 7 ways that you communicate as a coach. So we can get into all of those. Might end up being the whole podcast. But I would like to start as well just by sticking with the very first thing, the basic of verbal communication as a coach. And what are the things that you're thinking about? And this is something, as I say, as soon as I started looking into it, I was just super excited to pass it on. So I've done it a few times with individual clients and with group clients and stuff like that, and ways to look at it. Personally, the ways that I've split it up is mechanics of the voice, choice of words, then practice versus improvisation, which I think is a very, very useful thing to discuss. So sort of falls in this area, but maybe not quite so much. And then I did actually have I looked at the last notes that I took of a class when I was studying this. I had psychology of communication, but I think that one we can keep for later. So those kind of 3 areas would be, mechanics of the voice, choice of words, and planning versus improvisation. I think are all very interesting to dissect.
This is hilarious because that is a great practical framework, and we should definitely start there and go through them. My approach was sort of steps towards effective communication, and they're a little bit more, is the word ethereal, or like less tangible. So approach, audience, context, structure. But they're a bit more sort of like governing principles rather than tangible things. So we should definitely start with yours.
That's why I love having this kind of conversation, because what you're saying there is probably even more important, but that's the stuff that's more commonly talked about, which is why I think it's interesting to just say, for example, I have a daily exercise that I do for my voice, and I think every coach should do it. And I don't know why that's not something that people are told more often.
Mhm.
because having a more powerful voice, having a voice that you can control more, cannot be a bad thing. We've spoken about marginal gains before. That's like very not marginal because, like you say, what you do as a coach is decisions and communication, and that's basically it. So we should be putting work into
Yeah.
this.
Coaches, that was, I was listening to a podcast with a linguist, so someone that sort of studies discourse and describes the use of language in certain settings, and they were saying they came into high performance sport and it really struck them how much the coach dominates the bandwidth. Even if they say they're all about empowering athletes, like they decide when and where the athlete gets to speak and has input, and they frame it all with their words and what is said. So yeah, can't underpin that enough. But so what's the exercise you do?
I don't know. Sometimes it's not picked up on the microphone, but basically this sound like that. Can you hear that through the
First time I've heard that.
through the mic? Okay, so you also might now you'll hear me doing it before every podcast because I do it as a warm up as well. So what I do is I do that sound with pushing no air through at all. So I try and give you an example. Nico, you can tell me if this is just a horrible, horrible thing to go through all of this, but I think this will work. So without anything, just like this. So you're just blowing air through, nothing else. Then with the voice, I do each one 3 times, like that. Then stop, start, over and over and over again. Then trilling up and down. And then as the last one, pick a song and do the tune of the song again through the same thing. And it warms up my voice a lot. Now, I think this is probably useful for everyone, but this is something that I also did with a vocal coach. So she was sort of analyzing my voice a bit, and there's something about like it brings together the folds of your vocal cords better. And that was a problem that I had, but a lot of problem that a lot of people have when you have a slightly sort of breathy voice, and it gets rid of that. So it can be a very good warm up, but it's also good as just a daily exercise. Do it in the shower. If you shower at night or in the morning, especially if you shower in the morning, just doing that to start the day is really interesting.
Wow.
And really, really useful. So very simple. Just you can go back and look. I'm pretty sure still you can go back and look at the first videos that I made on this channel. I could link one in the description for the VOD. And see the way I talk, and hopefully all these mechanics of the voice things should be much better. But that first one is just a simple daily practice. If you can do a trill with your tongue, like that also works. But the lips one is easier because not everyone can do it with just the tongue. So you might as well just do explain the one that everyone can do, I think, or pretty much everybody.
Awesome. Well, one tangible technique that people at home can try.
Yeah,
I'm not going to try it on stream, partly because I might embarrass myself, but also partly because I'd be hoping by now maybe Nico, our producer, has lined up a hilarious sound to play over me while doing it that looks like I've made a fool of myself.
Okay, so that's one. Then for me, again, if we're talking about the mechanics of the voice, the way I like to look at it is the Ving Zhang method. So if you ever do his class, I think his class is unbelievably good, but the only thing I would say is that he gives so much away for free on YouTube that you might as well just watch all the YouTube stuff. But personally, I think people like this, I have no problem with them being successful and all that kind of stuff. So it's great to do the class as well. There's 5 things to be thinking about. And we're just talking about the mechanics, which is rate of speech, volume, pitch, tonality, and the pause, use of the pause. So those are the things that he looks at. I can get it depends how in depth you want to go. I can get the notes that I was taking from doing the course, and then with just pages and pages of this stuff, but I'll try and keep it as short as possible. But yeah, those 5 areas are really, really good to think about and to get into. And the simple way, if you just want your one line, vary all of them. And that's the key. So speaking fast is not a good thing for your communication. Speaking slow is not a good thing for your communication. Varying it is good.
Yeah.
Speaking loudly is not good. You know, every single one of those 5, just, well, the pause obviously is a bit different, but the top 4 at least, just being aware of them and trying to vary them whenever possible.
Yes.
Cool. That aligns with everything I've read. Varying it is important. Variety is good. You don't want to become monotone background noise. So yeah, we can get into my list, but as part of that second step, there was a point about expectations, and if you use those 5 aspects, if you use them wisely, you can use language in a way that people might expect and therefore they feel comfortable, but you might also use it deliberately in a way they don't expect to capture attention or inspire them or shock them in some way.
Exactly. And I think if we take the first one, just rate of speech, like we said, varying it is almost always the key and the simplest way to think about it. But if you want to go a little bit deeper into that, you can use faster rate of speech, then a slower rate of speech. Massively emphasizes what you speak slowly. So if everything's slow, nothing's emphasized, and maybe it very quickly becomes expected, and then people kind of tone it out. But varying it does allow you to emphasize the things that you want to emphasize. So maybe you're finally finishing a point in scrims. You might say at the beginning, okay, we did this and this thing really well. Really good job in this game. I think the way that we did the things that we've been learning, so you wouldn't say it like that, but the way we played around tempo was really, really good. And that's great to see. Then you might cover some smaller issues, some mistakes that we made. And if you want to bring it back to that moment, bring it back to those positives right at the end, that's a great time to finish your last point and let yourself speed up. Let yourself just quickly finish. Okay, right. So in next game, we need to make sure that we're flashing this way. And the way that we can know that is it's all about how much time you're buying for your AD carry. But guys, the way we played around tempo this game was absolutely fantastic. And even that, just going a little bit quicker and a little bit slower, can give you that kind of result that you want.
Brilliant. Even then, I felt pretty good about myself. I was going to give myself a pat on the back. Like, I played around tempo really well. Great.
always good. Always good.
Also on the pause, though, just to throw in a bit of sports psych work there, there's quite a lot of literature to talk about how a sports psychologist might work with an athlete and how it's quite important if you're talking to someone in that sort of therapeutic relationship, but also I think in a coach-athlete relationship, if you ask a question, to be comfortable in that space where there is a pause, and you can vary that probably to your benefit and to the benefit of the relationship. So yeah, what were the 5 again? I got rate of speech, volume, tonality, pause.
Pitch was number 3.
Okay.
So pitch is the melody, the note, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so you would say in your coaching now, in terms of practical application of this, are you deliberate about it, or have you got a good feel for it now, or are there things where you think, next time I'm going to try and introduce an element of that more or less?
It's both. It's partly it starts to become more natural.
Mm-hmm.
It's partly intentional if I've thought about it in advance, but it is also an endless skill that you can get better and better and better at, and that kind of thing. So it's definitely something to kind of pay attention to. I mean, one of the things again is as a practical tip is to do a voice audit for yourself, and you can do this once every 6 months. You can do this once every year. You can do this once and then leave it if you want, which would be to record yourself again. Absolutely unapologetically stealing this from Vin. Record yourself for 20 minutes. I think that's much better. Some people that I'd talked to before were talking about 5 minutes or 10, but full 20 minutes, unplanned, talk about a bunch of things. You can maybe have a list of topics you want to talk about, but mostly you're just speaking. Then listen to it, but listen only. So if you've recorded it on your phone, turn your phone upside down. Don't watch it, just listen. And make a note of the things that you're thinking while you're listening to it. Then mute it, watch only, and you're paying attention to the body language, the way you're moving around, if you're doing little things that make you seem quite nervous or like fidgeting, or if you're keeping, it's the thing of keeping your arms like close to the body and that kind of thing, or letting yourself be a bit freer. Then the last one he suggests is get it transcribed and put it through a kind of word cloud thing to look at the words that you use a lot too much. It's also a good check for your filler words as well. If the thing that comes up the biggest in the word cloud is or like, that's probably a good sign that it's a bit disruptive to your message. So doing these kind of voice audits or something can be very, very useful. Now, if you're a coach, obviously you can do that. But the other thing you can do is just look back at your own presentations, look back at your own talking to the team in whatever way, which is a good double thing. Now, the downside of that is you become a little bit less focused on just the voice thing, just the voice aspect of it, and you're focused a lot on actually what you say, which is okay. But the upside, of course, is that it's good time efficiency to be just paying attention to your voice as well as paying attention to what I actually said. So some sort of checking in is really useful. And again, that's why I started putting these things online, because I realized I could come back to it. Now I can come back to it 4 years later or whatever, when my first video came out, and look back and think, oh my goodness, that was horrible. That's so boring the way that's said. That's so uninteresting the way that I'm delivering it. And that's a very fun thing to think about as well.
Amazing. Oh, that's great. A real practical tip there. And funny how, again, that overlaps so much with what I've been reading around improving communication for sport coaches from academic papers. We'll get into this later, but of the few ways I found that people actually wrote at length about how to improve communication skill, so much of it was developing some self-awareness of how you communicate. And to do that, it was reviewing your coaching practice in some capacity. So trying to get a video of you coaching and watching it and identifying what you like, what you didn't like, maybe what was clear, what wasn't. When we should delve further into that later on, about how to develop it as well. Maybe we could touch on the 4 steps that I uncovered. I don't know if...
Yeah.
So I was looking at a YouTube video by a Stanford lecturer called Matt Abrahams, and this was about effective communication. And I think he's done quite a lot of work around it, judging by the amount of hits that I found with his name on it. And he spoke about 4 steps. The first one was the approach. So it was more of just a mindset towards communication. I think it as far as I could ascertain, it was really about just approaching communication in an open way. So being ready to change your perspective on communication. So what's being said, how it's being said, trying not to go into every conversation you have fixed in a certain, I want to achieve this in what I'm saying. And because I think his point was that it might create unnecessary friction and tension, and it might impair the effectiveness of what you're trying to convey if you expect it to go in one way and you're rigid in that. In fact, that becomes less communication and more instruction.
Yeah, I think as well that can be depending on the audience. And I would say, because there's some times where, especially as esports coaches, we probably need to do more of that and actually think, okay, what do you want as the outcome of this thing that you're doing? But yeah, absolutely. Making sure that it's not absolutely set and rigid, but sometimes if I look at someone's presentation, my first question is always, what do you want to have come out of this?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's actually a step that people have skipped over because it seems obvious. And then you realize and then you can start to think about, okay, I want them to take this information and be inspired and excited, or I want them to take this information and make sure that they're aware of how serious the problem is. And then you can start to think about, okay, the information part, we'll put that aside for now. How I get this part using these rate of speech, all that kind of thing. You can also do that as well. But definitely completely agree. The rigidity is absolutely killer. It has to go a certain way in your head. Even if you're just speaking to a group, if you can see it going a different way, it can fall apart so quick.
Well said. Yeah, that was better said than I could have put it. Definitely that. So the last 3 points, the third of these, or the second, third, and fourth steps of this 4-step approach, I thought were really good. One was appreciate your audience. So that's a level of understanding of what is the knowledge level of who you're talking to. Obviously, knowledge in terms of in our situation in an esports team is fairly easy to comprehend. So what is the knowledge of the, do they have knowledge of the situation of the game? Probably. It's probably done to quite a high level, so therefore you can pitch it at the right level. What are the expectations? This is something I linked earlier to your 5 points about speech itself. The expectations are you setting people up to know what to expect and therefore feel comfortable, but are you also deliberately using the opposite of that? So maybe at times you want to reinforce a point. So maybe you think the audience is expecting something and you give them something else, and you do that for a deliberate reason, which I thought was quite a nice subtlety to throw in there. There are a few other points there. Context was a big one, and I think it's when you read around coaching, everyone talks a lot about the context being so critical. So this is why it's so hard to generalize from an academic paper into your own coaching practice, because the context will be different. So here they spoke about things about appreciating the context, so knowing the time at which this intended communication scenario is happening. So if you're aware that if you want to talk to your boss about a raise and you have the meeting with this individual just before lunch on the busiest day of the week, and they might be hungry and a little bit impatient perhaps, maybe that's not the window of time then that you review your performance and ask for that raise. So just in that context, is this person going to be this way or the other? Emotion, so the use of emotion in our language seems critical. It's not just conveying the point, but it's also how we convey it, and that extends directly from what you were saying in far more detail. But it's also kind of using deliberately. This is where we talk about emotional labor in coaching. So for a coach, you are performing, and you can use emotion as a tool. So you can try and inspire people. You can try and deliver maybe a more sobering message after perhaps a big win in a semi-final, and you use language in a certain way to sort of maybe rein it all in a little bit and refocus and try and hit home an impactful message about, well, we've got jobs not done, that kind of thing. So the use of emotion there I thought was really important. And they also spoke about sort of location, but for this talk I was listening to, location was more, are you in person or online? And obviously a lot of our work in esports will be online. Even if it's a high level team, you often communicate. Those initial conversations with a player might be just an interview, and you're far apart geographically speaking. So appreciating the different types of language you have to use and you can use in those settings, those contexts is important. And structure was the final one. So structure is, he mentioned a few nice frameworks which I quite liked. So chronological, so if you're communicating a point, a lot of frameworks orientate themselves around past, present, and future. So for example, what has been happening, what are we doing now to combat that, or how are we doing on that, and what do we want to do in the future? So that's just a nice pattern that sort of comes up a lot in a lot of sort of best practice communication frameworks. What, so what, now what is another way. We've actually touched on this before when we were talking about self-awareness. So as a coach, if you're reflecting on your practice, you think about something that's happened in the past that maybe wasn't ideal or you'd like to improve. Why does it matter? The so what, and now what? What are you going to try going forward to improve it? And delivering that through what you're saying as a coach can be quite impactful and powerful. And he used this speaker used the sort of analogy that you're a tour guide. So in your communication, you are taking people on a tour from some observation to some meaning to some action, and you're taking them on that guide just like you would, that journey just like you would a tour guide through a city, for example. You're going from a destination to somewhere. That's a point. That's why you're saying things. So that was a nice. I thought those were nice 4 steps just to consider. But again, that's a more abstract level than the tangible stuff that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Anything there? Any sense?
No, I like it. I'm just thinking. So with the sort of, what was the what one again?
So we've got
Framework?
what, so what, now what?
Yeah. What?
So he was talking
now
about
what?
having structure in your communication. So having deliberate structure. And so
Mm.
here, this would be as a coach, yeah, our setup for Baron was awful. That could be a what? So what? Well, our comp really needed it. Now what?
Mm.
How are we going to work on it going forward?
Mm. Okay. And is that something that you would recommend to people they do consciously, or more they do get really familiar with it so you're naturally presenting your points like that? So if you take the Baron one as a specific example, obviously if we have the time to make a presentation about it and talk about it, absolutely should look at one of these things. Yeah, that's a whole other topic that we can, I'm sure, talk about for ages. The idea of like presentations as a coach, I think there's one again that we still are bad at. But anyway, if it's in a VOD review, you might not have time to do that. So is it worth just kind of getting really familiar with these structures so that they're natural in the way that you deliver stuff?
I think that's a good thing to aspire to, because you don't want to become too robotic and that everything you say is delivered in that way. So it's like, should we go for lunch at this new restaurant? And you go through that process. Like, it could get a bit tedious. But I think generally, as like good practice for coaches, we tend to overload players with information. Like, there's so much we see we want to get across. So actually, if you just start thinking about so what, now what, your what might help reduce the points down to actually what matters. And so maybe you go off on a tangent later on, but at least that core, this is what I'm focusing on. Maybe that's a nice thing to be able to practice and use in the spur of the moment. So I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think it's good. I think having it there ready as a tool, I think, is always going to be useful. And maybe again, getting it to the point where if you don't consciously think about it, you will put it into this structure. I think that can be a useful thing. But of course, I act like we never have time, but we quite often have a lot of time, because the last 5-10 minutes of a game are normally everyone knows who's going to win. So in that time, it's very common for coaches to go back through their points, rewatch stuff, and work out what they want to say, and they can work out, okay, based on this structure, how am I gonna lay it out? Now, the thing that I would say, again, having that VOD review as an example, is that those, especially for a lot of coaches, and I think we would both say for a good reason, can be more discussions than you just saying these things. And so if partway through your process you're getting interrupted, then maybe people think you're just going to say the what, because after what, someone jumps in every time. And so it is, I think, a dynamic that you have to find, but being conscious with all this stuff and being actually intentional with it, I think, is definitely a good thing.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a really good point as well. It sort of undoes this, is that, underpinning all of this is great. Like all these structures and frameworks for helping you convey a message clearly, it's all great. But I kept coming up against two things. Listening and relationships kept on coming up. And it seems to me that you can work on these frameworks all you like and implement them all you like. I think actually the way you speak, what you've touched on, I think, is always going to be helpful. But the frameworks I sort of stumbled across in terms of being able to improve the message you're conveying, they all seem to be a little bit undone by the fact that if you don't have a good relationship and understanding of the individuals you're communicating with, and if you don't have the listening skills and the self-awareness skills to identify how to convey a message and how you convey a message, it all seems to be a bit fruitless. So the two big things for me was, is communication, it's is it even worth thinking about the finer points if you don't have the relationship building skills?
Well, this is the thing, and that's why I almost wanted to find a new word for it, like outward communication or whatever it might be, because I think they're probably two topics for me in my head. They're two quite distinctive topics. And a lot of times, if I'm just thinking about the top end of esports coaches, so of course, there will be people just starting out who maybe can work on all of these skills, but people who've been in the scene for a long time, I'm not going to say any names, of course, mostly to get to the top as a coach, you do have to have some decent, not necessarily listening skills to get to the top of esports coaching, but you do at least need to be decent at that relationship building and getting, building those relationships, because it is almost a non-starter.
Mhm.
So the reason that I think it's really good to talk about all this stuff and the nitty gritty of literally like, okay, do this vocal exercise and you'll sound better, or stop saying and like every other word and you'll communicate much clearer, more clearly. It's something that we often don't consider at all. And the stuff that comes up if you say communication as a coach is the listening and those kind of things, which we're more familiar with, just like we talked about at the very beginning of the show. And so it is more, I would say, yes, it's more important. I think you can be a terrible public speaker and be a very good coach, but you can't be a terrible interpersonal speaker and be a bad coach. I don't know if that's a sensible distinction, but I also think you should get better at public speaking if you're a coach, because in reality, the day-to-day of your job, a huge percentage of it is public speaking. And the only reason we aren't better at it for most people is because they've never tried to learn it. And they see people on the stream and casters and just think, oh, they're a natural communicator and I'm not a natural communicator like that. And potentially some of them are, but like I say, you don't know that this person's not doing all the casters on the LEC, I'm going to guess, are doing like 5-10 minute vocal exercises every day. So of course they are also practicing loads of other stuff. But my point is that they put in work to look like they're a natural communicator. No one's a natural communicator to that level, you know. So I think that's something that we should consider more of. So I think those things that you're bringing up there, like the listening and stuff, I mean, we've talked about them on the podcast already, because I think they're even more foundational to being a good coach. But this, I'm still struggling to find something good to describe. Outward communication or public speaking, we could even say, is just something that we should talk about because no one is. And it's silly that no one is, I guess.
Yeah. And to your point as well, you could imagine it's a real advantage for you as a coach just to get your foot in the door with if you are a really good, let's say you are the terrible you have no interpersonal skills at all, you have great presentation skills and you can speak clearly and convey a message like on point, want of a better phrase. You could imagine that gets you through the tryout stage, and like people are impressed by that and taken by that, and they leave understanding what you were getting at, and that is a huge advantage. And then let's hope your interpersonal skills aren't a disaster.
They catch up.
Yeah, exactly. So one other thing, actually, you mentioned it, I think, very, very briefly earlier in the podcast, was improvisation.
Yes.
So
I love this topic.
I hadn't actually really put two and two together, but you mentioned there just about the casters, like warming up and practicing ready those skills. There's an American talk show host, I forget which one, who is he has a background in theatre and stage acting, and speaks often about attending an or attending improv or participating in sort of adult improv, and that seems to me now like that would be really useful training for a coach. I don't know, have you ever come across that or ever done it yourself?
Yeah, not that much. It's something that I've thought about doing some actual improv. Of course, conversations like this are also improv, and that's kind of a bit of what I mean. So I think there's a really interesting, again, if we're just focused on the public speaking aspect of coaching, I think there's a really interesting dynamic there around improvisation. And actually, I think it's just a fascinating topic around improvisation and speakers. So, I mean, we can get onto that, but shall I just quickly go over the rest of my mechanics of the voice thing, and then we'll jump to that one, and we can come back to the kind of choice of words. So we covered rate of speech, again, varying being a good thing. If you want, again, the shortest way, faster is less important, slower is more important. Volume is kind of the same in a way. We should vary our volume, but quieter is, brings people in, and louder is more emphasizing of the point. I think it's also a very good framework. I can't remember who this was, but thinking about how big the room is, and you should be trying to, fill the room, as it were. Not necessarily literally the physical space, but if you're speaking to one person, you should be a lot quieter than if you're speaking to a group of people. And they had a thing where on a video call, you should have, wait, I've written it down. Imagine you're in a room with 5 to 10 people, even if it's just me and you. I mean, and Nico's here as well, but as in going for that kind of level, like this is how loud I would speak and how much I would articulate.
Yeah.
That's the wrong word, but anyway. For a room of kind of 5 to 10, and it becomes smaller and quieter and more intimate the less people you're talking to. So that's the kind of volume one. Now, the other thing is pitch and melody. So varying it. There's a really good analogy which is just kind of being passed around, which is that your voice is an instrument and you should use the whole instrument. So if you are very monotone, that means you're not using the other notes that you can play, and having a lot more melody becomes much more memorable. So the example you hear a lot is, if you have a favorite book, could you recite a page of that book? And most people, even if they have a book they love, they read a lot, that's almost impossible. But if I said, do you have a favorite song? And can you sing the lyrics to that song? You probably have hundreds of songs potentially that you could do that for. There's some people, I mean, I pick up song lyrics by accident, the songs that I don't know. And it's because that melody allows it to be much more memorable.
Wow.
And that's why poetry was a thing, because the rhythm and the melody of the words allows you to remember it much better than you would just remember a speech, for example. So including that in your voice, again, really, really good. Then tonality is the next one he talks about, which is actually the emotion underlying what you're saying. And this is where it comes into, having the improv and acting and stuff is probably very useful and good to show that. With all of these things, because your voice is connected to you, the more you do this, the louder you will be able to become. But in this same way, if you smile and you talk, you will sound more happy. And that's the tonality that comes across is that happiness. And the same with all the other things, like angry and all that kind of thing. So yeah, those are the ones that are about, making sure that you vary them. And we won't go into all the tiny details of when you might use each emotion, because mostly it's what you'd expect. And the other thing that I think, again, is a practical tip, which is from a lot of communication, or actually Chris Voss uses this example as well when he's talking about negotiation, is finding people who haven't heard you before, the kind of neutral ears. If you listen to this podcast and think, oh my God, that would be amazing, I'd love to be much more interesting to listen to. I was thinking that you're either naturally good at this or bad, but actually if it's a skill, I can practice. And then you go back home and you're suddenly way louder than you normally are. People are going to be like, why are you being weird? Why are you being so loud? That's weird. But you actually realize that if you go to someone who doesn't know you, it's not strange. It's not that you are a quiet person. It's that you've shown people over and over again that you are quiet. And so when you're not quiet, the difference is the thing that's strange. Whereas if you talk to someone in the shop, and you talk to the cashier and you're just really loud when you say, no, I don't want a receipt or whatever, they're not going to be like, oh, John's normally really quiet, so that's weird, because they never met me before. So finding like neutral ears to practice, I think, is also another really good practical step when you start learning this stuff yourself, or exploring it, I should say, yourself, not learning it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Good tips.
Then the last one is pausing, which is, as we've spoken about, maybe there's some times where a filler word is better, but I would say for 99% of people, pausing is also the best way to avoid filler words, where from the beginning, a thing to do is to just, rather than say the filler word, just pause. And pauses can be very effective when you use them intentionally, because they emphasize the thing that you're saying, both before and after, in fact, the pause. But also it can be useful to get rid of those filler words as well. So that would be the first step. It's not, okay, don't say like or but when you feel yourself just about to say it, just don't say anything instead, and you'll start to work on that. But that really is a skill. That does take time, and I would recommend not just doing that in the voice audits and that kind of thing, but trying to get that into your normal conversations as well and just see how it goes, because you will still have them. I still use plenty of filler words, but a lot less than I used to, especially when I'm on camera.
Yeah, you don't use many at all. I've been hyper conscious of it in this podcast because we started with it. But yeah, I noticed you don't use many at all, and I also noticed how but I noticed how broken my speech is. Podcasting is really not. It's an interesting place to learn about your own language and your own language skills for sure.
Yeah, in front of everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway,
No,
yeah.
but it's as all of this stuff and all the skills are, it's just about taking from where you are to getting better at it. It's not about comparing yourself to other people. There is, of course, some natural thing to this as well. I don't think that all these fantastic speakers that you see are just skill. It's also, I mean, has all the players as well. Like it's talent, but it's also hard work and learning it as a skill. So I think that's really, really good. So that's my kind of mechanics of the voice. Again, could talk about them all for hours, but considering we've been 50 minutes already, we can park that for now if you want and move on to improvisation. Or
Well, I had one question about.
Hmm.
Can you recall a moment recently where you used a pause for good effect in the team environment, or if you can't remember a specific, a moment where you might typically insert a pause deliberately?
I think that I use it a lot.
Okay.
So I just don't mind pausing when I speak. And I think that, to be honest, is the key one here, really, for me. It's, yes, it can be used intentionally before your big killer point or just after your big killer point, for example. But mostly it's just not being afraid of it. That's the actual practical tip. And when I listen to people who are maybe just getting into this kind of public speaking thing or coaching and are a little bit less practiced or haven't thought about it at all, it's that constant stream of saying stuff over and over and over again and just never leaving a pause no matter what. And you're going to fill it with something else. And so it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. And there's never even a pause when they speak. When they breathe and they just, it just keeps going. So for me, I use pauses. I pause a lot. I wouldn't say that I use pauses a lot. I just am unafraid of them in my speech. But I'm sure every single presentation I think about is some good moments to pause. And the other thing, which seems a bit silly, but is actually really important to remember, is after questions, you should actually pause. And if you want an answer, wait until there's an answer. But for me, it's just after every single point that I want it to be, this is a real point that we take forward. I'm always pausing. Even if I don't want someone else to jump in, I'm always making sure that I leave that space afterwards so that we have time to process the thing that I just said. So yeah, I'm unafraid of them. And I guess I would probably say I use them after every single point. So I use them enough that I couldn't think of a good example until just now.
Yeah. Good excuse. Definitely. I can think of a few times in my modest sports career where pauses have been used to good effect by coaches. I think a couple of times where this might be fiction in my brain that I'm sort of reconstructing from several different games, but I sort of remember a time where tense game that mattered, halftime. It was a moment of like the coach came into the changing room. We're all there. We're all sort of a bit on edge, and it was sort of like, "So guys, here we are. Take a breath. Long pause." And it was kind of like we all, I think, in that moment realized the tension that we had and how maybe that was reflected in our play. If memory serves, it was a close game and a game that mattered, and actually just drawing attention to how we're currently feeling and experiencing that moment can be quite useful. And you can do that in a pause if you have that level of understanding with your team, because I think it comes back to that relationship point. But if the understanding isn't there, it could just look like coaches at lost for words, or it could maybe give rise to one of the players wanting to fill it and take it away from the intended.
Yeah.
purpose.
I think that is a thing, and especially when you're online, it's something to
Right.
think about. So even this podcast, for example, is substantially harder doing it online because there's a little bit of latency. So normally in a conversation, when I want to butt in or whatever, I want to find a moment where you pause so I can jump in. But you pause and then you start talking again because there's a milliseconds of delay on both ends, and then we're both talking at the same time and all that kind of thing. But I would just say is when you start to get more comfortable with this, you'll realize that you can pause more than you think and people won't jump in, especially if you do it at the right moment. If you're pausing in the middle of a sentence, it's almost obvious for everybody to not jump in, or you hit a really big hard point that's a point and not a question, and you can pause. But then you will start to learn, like you say, that how long can I pause with this group?
Yeah.
If I ask a rhetorical question, do I need to make sure that the pause is, obviously you want the pause to be there so that people actually think about it, but you want to jump in before they actually think about it and answer.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? Like, do we really want to win today?
Yeah.
Probably can't be too long a pause, because if someone says, yes, I would like to win, that starts to get a bit silly. But that's again, reading the room and all that kind of stuff. But you can't get better at that until you're aware that it's this thing that's going on, that naturally huge amount of us are kind of afraid of pauses in our speech, and we shouldn't be, and they're great.
Yeah, agreed. Pause for effect.
Great. Okay. So how do we learn and develop all of this? Because so much of it
Is there's probably a mix of background to all of this, but you are in a coaching position. You're probably in that coaching position in part because you are a reasonable communicator, or at least perceive yourself to be, and maybe you perceive yourself to be a good leader. And part of that is because you think communication is good for leadership, and so you've done it enough over time, and you feel like your skills have developed by just doing it. Is that true? Is that how it goes?
I think you might feel that way. Yeah, that was my example from the beginning. I felt that way, but it takes a fresh perspective to realize that there's a huge amount more to do, or actually realize that you never really tried to learn this and you just picked it up naturally. It's like if you're playing football in the park with your friends, you might get slightly better at football, but the first time you go to a football training session, you'll realize, oh my goodness, this is a bit different, and maybe there's a lot more that I could get from this. So for me, I think doing this like audit for yourself, it also helps when you're not looking or you're not listening to judge it a bit more fairly. Sometimes we judge overly harshly. A lot of times when you listen back to yourself, I think you tend to judge overly harshly. When you do it in the moment, you tend to judge overly nicely. So getting a bit of both, I think, is good. But I think, to be honest, like I say, being aware of it, even if you're someone listening to a podcast like this and you're still listening, that's already a better sign than a lot of people currently, at least in the esports space, who I think still really struggle with this and don't see it as a skill. So just, it is as simple to start as seeing it as a skill. And I'm no longer going to just play football in the park with my friends and, oh, well, I'm trying to win, therefore I must be getting better at football. I'm instead going to find someone who teaches people how to get better at football and do the things that they tell me to and try them out, and then compare myself now to when I was 6 months ago, just playing it for fun. And you'll see a huge improvement. It's the exact same, I think, for something like this.
Yeah, definitely agree. I would add some keywords, like things like authenticity and
consistency
came up in my hunt around this topic, and reviewing your own communication and mannerisms and gestures and all of that. Why it is so important is you sort of you develop your self-awareness, you develop some strengths that you have in your communication, you develop what you like, what aligns with how you see yourself as a coach. And somebody put it quite interestingly in a podcast I was listening to, where if you can review your own coaching and you can focus on your communication and develop your self-awareness, you can use elements of your communication as tools. So you can use them deliberately. If you don't have the self-awareness, you can't
deliberately use those aspects of your communication. And that sounds obvious when you lay it out like that. But once you know that maybe you really have a kind of a style of communication that really is inspirational to listen to. So when you're really
Okay, we're back. Tech problems. There was a massive power cut. So unfortunately, we lost what we were talking about, but there wasn't one in France or Belgium. So we just kept on talking. So I think the kind of summary of what we were talking about for this whole like mechanics of the voice and that kind of thing that's really, really good that we got to at the end is that it's just about having those tools available to you as a coach. And sometimes in halftime team talk or in a best of 5, if you're in League of Legends, sometimes there just needs to be a big injection of emotion into the team. And if you don't have the ability to do that as a coach, that becomes a weakness if it's not something you naturally do. So I'm not someone who naturally was good at that. And that's why I started this whole journey. And then the reverse is also true. If you are naturally really good at that, but maybe you struggle a little bit more with the smaller moments, the little moments between people, and you can't say the right things in the right way to get the right emotions out of someone individually, one-on-one, then that's also a weakness. So it's worth looking into all this stuff to just make sure that you have those tools available just in case you need them. So that's now been I'm always too ambitious with the titles of thinking like, what are we going to talk about? That's been one of the 3 sections, or maybe even 4 sections, and it's taken an hour and 10 minutes nearly. So we'll move. I think you mentioned improvisation before, and I think this is a fantastic and very interesting topic. Maybe again, one step a little bit further away from topics that are directly relevant to coaching, but I think it's really interesting to talk about. So for me, I would move on to improvisation. Is that something that came up in the way that you were researching this around communication? And if so, how?
there is, I mean, improvisation actually as a term pops up in a few different papers. And often they pop up in the papers that we look at sports coaches as performers. And there's a few papers out there in the sports coaching world on this idea of dramaturgy. I think that's how you say it. So this idea that actually being a coach is a sort of a drama. Like you are acting, you are playing a role, and you are performing in the literal sense. Like you're putting on a performance. And so improvisation is part of that, because we're sort of trying to say that you are in an environment that is characterized by uncertainty. It's unpredictable. There are things that you rehearse, but that cannot ever be sort of one-to-one replicated. And so there are times where an unexpected thing is thrown at you, and you have to deal with it in a way you hadn't planned for. So that's, as I understand it, that is improvisation. So you are improvising what to do and how to steady the ship, and it meets its strongest point when, for example, you feel like as the coach, you have responsibility for helping the group move forward, like to help your group of players move forward. And you feel like if you make the wrong call in that moment, everything could fall apart. And you have to improvise a way forward where everyone stays focused or stays confident, stays together. And it's not something you get it's not something you get another shot at. So if there's a conflict that might be brewing between some players on your team in the middle of a best of 5 series in an important event, and you manage that poorly, you can't redo. So that's where this idea of improvisation in coaching comes from. And I mean, a lot of I haven't read, to be fair, I haven't gone deep dive into this topic specifically, but I haven't read much that would say that we necessarily train coaches to be better at improvisation. It's more about, I think a lot of the work would suggest, textbooks would suggest, for example, that we actually do a lot of our coaching work in advance to avoid those situations where it could be so negative.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's really good. I mean, again, for me, I was thinking about it, not purely, but mostly from the kind of public speaking side of things as well. But of course, that is, knowing what to say in that halftime or between games team talk is a great example. But of course, the other one that's very common is presentations that we give. That's quite a standard thing in League of Legends. So starting the day with a presentation, how much should you prepare it? How much should you improvise? And I think that's a really good way to think about it. And for me, at least with that, which hopefully might apply to these other situations that you're referencing, which can be even more important, is actually the preparation can allow you to improvise much better. So if we take, again, actually, if we use Vin Zhang as an example, he used to be a keynote speaker. So of course, your entire job is to give an hour or 45-minute talk to 6,000 people. And keynote speakers get paid a huge amount. And if they're good. And at one point he references this story where he was kind of struggling with that. And a business associate of him was saying, no, you're not getting paid this much money for an hour. You're getting paid for 8,000 hours because 8,000 people are watching you. And if it's not good, you're wasting all of their time. And that amount of money now suddenly seems appropriate. So I think, again, actually in esports, we have the opposite problem to a lot of cases, which is that most times, I think most people could be far more prepared with what they're telling the team. So the Vin rule was you should practice it at least 10 times. Now, we don't really have the time for that. If you make a presentation that's going to last half an hour for tomorrow, you don't have time to practice it 10 times, because that means when you're done, all the work you did to get there, you now have 5 hours of just repeating the same thing over and over again. But that's still a good benchmark to be aiming at. It shouldn't be the first time you're thinking about what you're going to say is when you start talking. And that, I think, is a really, really big one that we can do better. So before you do your VOD review, use whatever time you have once you know the game is done to think about what you want to say and how you want to say it. But if you're planning a presentation, it shouldn't be the first time you're going over it again is when you're talking about it with everybody. You need to be thinking, when am I moving to the next slide? How am I saying this stuff? Again, bringing in all this mechanics of the voice and that kind of thing. And where might I pause? Where might I be louder? Where might I be quieter? All those kind of things I think is very, very useful. But it's almost, there's a quote from Miles Davis that I really like, which is improvisation is the freedom and space to hear things. And the thing that I really like about that is it does connect preparation and improvisation. You don't have the space to feel what the audience is feeling if you're worried about what you're going to say next, because your entire focus is inward, and great public speakers focus is outward, despite the fact that everyone's looking at them. And that's why people say, oh, it's different every place I give the talk, even if it's a very well prepared talk, or comedy especially. Good comedians, they're flexing based on the crowd's response. And they might overemphasize things or underemphasize things depending on the response of people around them. And you do that as a coach all the time. So you might be giving a presentation and see someone is getting a little bit bored is maybe the wrong word, but their attention is maybe starting to go. And so there's some things you can do to make it more exciting again. Get louder, change the rate of speech, all that kind of thing. Or maybe rather than me ask the question to everyone, I'm going to ask the question to that person because I've noticed that they need to be kind of brought back in to what we're doing. But I can't do that. I can't look around the room if I'm just focused on what I'm saying next. So prepare enough to give yourself the space to improvise around the stuff that you're saying. And I think that as a kind of rule of thumb is good. But I do think it is important to have this 10 times in mind, because even if you can't do that, you should realize the level that we're talking about. And for example, if Vin does some online live masterclasses, and there's always comments in the Twitch stream like this is pre-recorded, because he's so prepared, and it really looks like it's just a video that you're watching, and then he'll talk to the chat and suddenly you realize it's not that. And that's, I think, just a good thing to show the potential, even compared to other speakers who I've been to their talks, and it's quite obviously live, and it's not as smooth as their videos, but it's still useful. Whereas this kind of thing, I think, is really, really good. So being familiar enough with the material and familiar enough with your approach. Again, referencing last episode, why it's so good to have this like coaching philosophy, familiar enough with how you want to approach situations, so that in those situations you actually have the space and the freedom to hear things, for the Miles Davis example.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, wise words. Fantastic. And that's a great point about improvisation. Also, while you're giving your talk, which could be very rehearsed, you are reading the room and reacting to that. And knowledge of those individuals will help. But also, if you see someone nodding off, then you've got to adjust. So
there's a podcast that I absolutely love called Cautionary Tales by Tim Harford, which I think I might have referenced here. It's not about coaching, but it's about things around life, and there's a lot of things that are very useful. And one of them he does on this thing of improvisation, and he's talking about Martin Luther King, and the title is Martin Luther King Jr. and the Jewelry Genius, or something like that. And he's comparing these two speeches, the I Have a Dream speech and a speech that basically Gerald Ratner, his name is, gave, that pretty much killed his massive multi-million-dollar company. And he made a load of jokes which people afterwards in the press deemed as inappropriate, and he was kind of mocking his own customers in a kind of playful way, but not really. Didn't go that well, and he literally killed this company. And then, of course, I Have a Dream speech, possibly the most famous speech of all time in the English language, and endlessly quotable and memorable, and changed the nation. And he goes through all of this stuff around preparation, and about how Martin Luther King used to prepare everything like over and over again. He used to write it out. He used to know every single word he's going to say, and he used to never say anything off those words when he was a preacher. But actually, this is quite common for this podcast, in the end, you realize that it's the other way around. And in these two speeches, the one that was improvised is the I Have a Dream speech. So very famously, that actual line is completely improvised. That line and that segment is not what he had written down. We've still got the writing, and it's not there. Whereas all these jokes had been written down and workshopped, and in the environments of the workshop, they were completely fine. And just chatting amongst your friends, they're great. And actually, even in the room, they were great. But written up in the press afterwards, they weren't. But yeah, he just uses this example that it's knowing the material a lot, then giving the space to flex some of it, So 80-90% of it absolutely down to a T, which quite often we don't in esports, which allows that 10% to flex. So the rest of the speech is absolutely written, but I think it was the performer before him she was performing a song which had some line about a dream in, and they might have even talked about it, and then you can hear her shout from the crowd, tell them about the dream, and then he starts on this bit, and I've got the most famous, like I say, probably the most famous speech in the English language is made up on the spot. So having that ability to tie into not only what people are obviously saying, but to tie into the energy of the room as well, I think is absolutely crucial. But again, I want to stress, it really does come from a place of knowing the material well enough before you get into anything else.
Yeah, and that also far surpasses my notes, where I had planned a few questions. So ahead of going into a coaching session, make sure you've got like a couple of open and closed questions, preferably open, that you might want to use to check for understanding of your intended point. So, but that's quite all very inspiring. So the preparation is definitely key.
Yeah. Okay. Should we?
Right.
We have sort of 10 minutes left. We did mention before that we would try and end each one with a kind of brief Q&A. There's a couple of questions from Jack in YouTube. And if you have any other thoughts on this topic, we can do that as well. Maybe I'll very quickly cover the kind of choice of words thing, because this is an endlessly deep topic. So we'll just kind of cover it very briefly. The thing that I like is precise as possible, uncommon as possible. But the massive caveat, as it seems like a lot of my sayings, as possible could mean very, very simple. Because the other thing you have to bear in mind that I think a lot of people who teach this topic really, really suffer from is they're English or American, and they don't realize that a huge percent of their audience is their second language, and you have to do that as a coach, especially in European League of Legends. People are going to have varying levels of English, and it will be their second language. So you shouldn't judge the fact that they're varying levels. You should be super impressed with the fact that they're doing this in their not mother tongue, and you have to, or you get the privilege of doing it in yours if you are English or American or something like that. So yeah, precise as possible with your language and uncommon as possible. So the main thing being precise as possible, using the right word because it's better, because it's more precise. So not everything is good. Maybe there's other things that you could say other than good, and only use them if they're more precise in that moment, or they're slightly more uncommon is also useful. So they're just varying it. So this might be good, this might be fantastic, this might be incredible. They also are more precise because incredible is much more good than good. So that's what the precise thing kind of means as well.
Yeah. Nothing to add. That's
good.
Great.
We were quick on that one. So now we'll get to stuff in the chat. I mean, I'm assuming my chat bot is still connected and still able to see things, but I've got a couple from earlier from Jack. So how do you value the technique of communication over the psychology of what you say, essentially the ability to manipulate people to create the environment that you want? That's actually an interesting one as well for a separate reason. But firstly, is that a bad thing that we're trying to basically manipulate people as a coach? Because you sort of are in a way when you're communicating. Someone is not filled with energy and you're trying to manipulate them to fill them with energy and stuff like that. What's your thoughts on this whole thing?
The way you've said that has maybe challenged my thought on it, because I mean this is like the darker underbelly of sports coaching research is things like, can we truly empower athletes when we as coaches hold all the power, even if we say, yeah, but I ask my athletes a lot of questions. Well, you were asking the questions, so you hold a lot of power and control there. So there is a certain Machiavellianism that you could, if you watched a coach, you could say, well, it's controlling and it's means to their end rather than in the good of the group. So they are engaging in these behaviors because they want to win. So that's kind of, you're playing puppeteer a little bit. So you could say that, and you can point that out, and that is a subject of greater scrutiny in sports coaching research. In terms of manipulation, I think, sure, if we use it just on its surface level meaning of a change, then you have to assume that the coach is working in the best interest of the team and that individual. And my own ethos on this is from some well-established research around coaching containing within it a duty of care. So in that, what I mean by that is you should only be a coach if you care about your role as a coach, but you also care about the people you work with to some extent, and you care about the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So unless you've got all three in place, I would question your motives for being a coach. So assuming that you do have the desire to work with people and enjoy that journey with people, and you take some, for want of a better word, pride in their development and in doing a good job to support them. Assuming that's in place, like maybe the manipulation term is quite useful here, because you are manipulating something about the atmosphere, the environment, the team climate, but you're manipulating it in a direction that you think meets their needs and their goals as well as your own. So in that sense, I don't maybe shy away from the term manipulate. It's a bit affronting, a bit confronting, but it's probably not too far wrong. What was the question? I've gone off track here.
I mean, that's basically it. That was my question, at least around it.
The first part was quite interesting, though. What was the first part?
How do you value the technique of communication over the psychology of what you say? I think
right.
this is what we sort of started talking about. I
Yeah,
think it's the balance of both that is important. And
definitely.
picking the right things to say, but saying them in the right way, I think is both important. And you can, I would say people kind of understand or accept to the whichever one is lower. If you speak in a really great way, but you say the wrong things, then it'll be
Yeah,
like this level. And if it's the other way around, then it'll again be the way you say it can kind of inhibit what you're trying to say, even if what you're trying to say is really, really good. And that actually is another thing that is useful to have in your mind as a coach, is that oftentimes your role in a discussion might just be that, okay, this player can't articulate this thing. How do I articulate it for them? Because maybe a coach is probably more likely to be better at the communication aspect because it's a more core part of the skill set needed to be a coach to get to that level. Even if you haven't looked at this, you would probably need to have a better communication than as a player.
yeah,
So how can you use that to help them and explain something that they're trying to explain or something like that? So that's
Yeah.
another one that's another reason why it's useful to be aware of all this stuff.
Yeah, I might even go. You might reject this somewhat, but I would probably push for in esports coaching specifically, and specifically the sort of non-elite level, so the remote teams, online teams. I actually think the lack of non-verbal body language is a significant impairment, and therefore what is said and how it is said has to be even better. And my science meets strategy academic sort of point on that, there's a golden rule of communication, which is this researcher Merabian and Ferris, 1967, a pie chart here, and the pie chart contains the relative importance of different forms of communication, and they include words used being 7% of the pie, tone of voice being 38%, and body language being 55% of the importance of the of the meaning being conveyed in that communication. The caveat here is that is said to be in ambiguous situations. So if there is an ambiguous situation where everyone's a little bit uncertain, maybe they don't know you so well and they don't really know the message being conveyed, your body language will inform them the most about what you're trying to say. Now, that was 1967, and that's ambiguous situations, and I don't really know how that pie chart looks today with probably a bit more evidence based underneath it. But the point is, body language is important, and if you don't have that as a coach in esports because you're working with an online team, and your verbal communication skill isn't great, you're almost certainly going to be struggling.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I think Hitch, the Will Smith movie Hitch, maybe opens with that exact same fact. I would also say that, like with a lot of things around that doesn't also cover, because that sounds quite scary, I think, if you're listening to this, but that also doesn't cover how easy it is to get those percentage. So the example that I would always give on this kind of thing is people say like nutrition is, I don't know what the exact figure is. It depends on what month you ask, but it's 70% or 80% of getting into the shape that you want to be.
Oh, okay, right.
And that's true. But on the other hand, just not eating stupidly gets you 99% of or 95% of that gain. Just eating what your mum told you to eat when you were younger, like making sure you have some vegetables and you don't have loads of pizzas, will get you most of that. So it's like, okay, yes, nutrition is a bigger part than your workout plan, and people spend lots of time on their workout plan, and maybe they should spend more time on their nutrition, maybe, but also just don't eat stupidly covers most of it, whereas just go to the gym covers a decent amount, but not anywhere near as much. So I would say making sure that you're expressive with your body language and all that kind of thing can be amazing, and you should put effort into doing that properly. But even just checking that your body language isn't saying the exact opposite thing,
Right.
it gives you a huge amount of that, whatever it was, 50% of the communication instantly. So it's not as scary as it sounds.
No, I agree. I was pushing more for like teams where maybe webcams aren't on at all.
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted by that. But yeah, absolutely. I think I completely agree. And also, we just covered improvisation and hearing the room, responding to the room. If no one's webcam is on, and because mics don't pick up little sighs and stuff, the room might just be dead silence the whole time. And it might be dead silence, and that's great. And it might be dead silence, and that's awful.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that you don't know if someone's just looking at another screen on Twitter.
And you
Or
can't.
my thing is speaking to their chat on stream.
Yeah. Checking one of a billion other screens. Also, you can't necessarily console someone with like an arm on their shoulder, like the physical touch. You can't high five someone. That's also hard to. It's probably a handicap in some respects. So, also, funnily enough, you talking about nutrition there got me thinking about like what are the micronutrients and macros of communication. But that's probably that's an infographic for.
Yeah, for another time. I think that's a useful one, though. Great. So we'll leave it there, I think, for the episode. I completely agree with what you're saying about manipulation. It's like, okay, if you want to use the technical term, yeah, you're manipulating people, and you have to find where that line is for you. If it's like, okay, I'm manipulating them for their own good, then that's maybe your thing. Or, as long as it's not too, you make sure you're clear that you're all there for the same purpose, and then from then on, it's like now you're almost giving permission when you enter one of these environments. It's like, okay, as a coach, you're given the permission to do this. And the other thing is that it's actually a good way to think about it, because you should take it seriously, and you should be checking in with people that you're not pushing them too far and all that kind of thing. So yeah, good question. I think actually, unfortunately, the YouTube maybe has not worked, so we haven't got any more from that. But that also means that we can stop roughly on time. So thanks everyone for listening. Again, the title was 2 different topics and we only covered one, and even then we could have talked about it for longer. So that is what it is. The VOD title will be correct, and I'll make a new thumbnail: public speaking and communication as a coach, something like that. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Next week we're going to have a special episode with more information about that to come shortly, as well as the launch of a social media channel for this show. So do be on the lookout for all of that. You'll be able to find it on Twitter and stuff, but the location won't change. It will still be here for the foreseeable future. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and hope you have a good evening.